Today, I want to talk to you about your next shooting assignment, which is line and texture. That is what you're going to be focusing on for this assignment. And so I want to talk about lines to start and what line really looks like in photography and how it can be really effective in creating like moods and feelings and also just movement within a picture. Oops. So the first lines we have are horizontal lines, lines that go across the landscape of your picture. You can see in this picture here of piano keys how the horizontal lines are present. I want you to also notice the depth of field. Remember, the depth of field is how much of our picture is in focus, going back into the picture plane. If you look here, it's really just these two, maybe even just this key that is really sharp and in focus. Everything before it and everything behind it gets more gradually blurry as you go away from there. That is a shallow depth of field, and that is what I really want us to focus on for this project, is how you utilize your depth of field to get effects like this. Horizontal lines create a sense of homeostasis, like lack of change. Think of when you're lying down in a bed, you're horizontal, you're resting, you're not moving very much, things are not happening. And that is kind of the way that horizontal lines subconsciously make us feel when we look at them. There's also a sense of timelessness to them, especially if they extend beyond the edges of your picture plane. So if you have your edges here and your line goes beyond those edges, you get a sense of timelessness. Lack of change, that kind of goes along with homeostasis, obviously. I even listed there twice. And just things staying very steady and the same. Calm, of course. Horizontal lines are calming. Again, think of lying down. If you ever are feeling tired or need a quiet moment, you can lie horizontally. That really helps. That's what a lot of people do. Vertical lines. That's your other type of line. Very much straight up and down with our vertical lines. They give us a sense of peace and strength and stability when we see lines going straight up and down. They seem more powerful or have more substance or permanence than our horizontal lines. You can think of like tall trees in a forest and things like that. Next, we have our diagonal lines. Those create a little bit more interest and a dynamic in our photos that the other things don't. They create a little bit more of a sense of movement or action. If you look down here, our eyes are following the curve of those stairs and all those diagonal lines. You definitely get a sense of movement and action. Again, very powerful. You know, a lot like the vertical lines that we talked about, they have a lot of power to them and substance. They force movement. They force our eyes to move around a picture. Horizontal lines do not feel like they're standing still. In fact, think of somebody standing there with their legs straight. If somebody is standing in a picture and they're not moving, their legs and arms are straight down. But if all I did was like take my leg out one way, my arm out another way, then suddenly you get this idea, even if you can't see me move, that I'm moving. The final type of lines that I want to highlight are diverging lines. And these lines are really important because these are the lines that are going to give us the most interest in our photographs, the most movement. They're going to feel like they're sucking the viewer into the picture. And that is really important to an image. And those are the types of images that make you stop and think, oh, that is a beautiful image, because you're diving into the picture. If you look at these railroad tracks in this image, they're going off into the distance. This is also when our depth of field becomes really important, because diverging lines are going away from us in real life. We want them to look like they're going away from us in the picture, which is very easy to do. It's all about the angle you take the picture at. However, your depth of field matters. When you see an image that with a shallow depth of field in these instances, it forces us, even though we're going deep into the picture, it forces us to stop and notice what the artist has focused on. That's an important part of it. If you choose to use a really deep depth of field, like this picture right here, then you're going to kind of feel like you're diving into the picture, which is also a good thing. You can use it either way to your advantage. Now, I just want to review really quickly. You each have this little shooting cheat sheet right here. And I realize it's backwards in there, but I want you to take a minute to look at it because on there under aperture and f-stop, I give you a little cheat sheet on here of which goes towards shallow depth of field and which goes towards a deep depth of field. So if you just want to really have your viewer focus on one section and you want to use a shallow depth of field, you're going to go towards the smaller numbers. Remember, the smaller the number, the smaller the depth of field. And the opposite is true for a deep depth of field. If you want, like in this picture right here, where everything's in focus going back, then you're going to use a deep depth of field, which is a higher number. Okay? Remember that. It's important. Now, what happens if you want to have a really deep depth of field, but you can't get your light meter in the center? Most likely it's probably on the negative if you can't get it in the center on a deep depth of field. What do you change? You don't want to change your aperture. You have to change your shutter speed. If you are choosing your aperture based on the depth of field that you want to have, which is what I want you to do for this project, I want you to control your depth of field by controlling your aperture. Then you're going to have to decide that beforehand and then change your shutter speed to whatever you need to change it to get it in the center. Now, what happens if your shutter speed goes below 60? You see right there, I've got a little warning sign that's even highlighted. It's totally fine if you go with a slow shutter speed. It's not going to affect anything unless you have things moving in your picture. But other than that, if you go below a shutter speed of 60, you need a tripod. I can't emphasize that enough. You cannot hold your camera still enough with a shutter speed less than 60. So if you choose your aperture based on your depth of field, and then you use your shutter speed to get your light meter into that perfect center, you have to realize that if you're using a shutter speed that's slower than 60, you're going to need a tripod, or you're going to have to sacrifice your depth of field to get a faster shutter speed. All right, we'll talk about that another day. The other thing about diverging lines is that they promote eye movement. You know, your eye can't stand still in a picture where there are diverging lines. It just naturally follows the road back. All right, next, texture. The other part of this project I want you to focus on is texture. Now, I don't want you to just go out and take pictures of things that look bumpy, okay? I want you to focus on what we call macro photography. You get close to things, and if you shoot them at the right angle, you can really show off your textures. If I just stood up and took a picture of a gravel driveway from standing position, it's going to look super boring. However, if I laid down on the ground, if I put my camera on the ground and shot that gravel from the side, it's going to look like interesting little hills and valleys. All of a sudden, I have an inside view of what the gravel looks like. It's a totally different perspective, and suddenly it's much more interesting. Same with the bricks on the buildings and things like that. I can take a picture of the bricks on my wall behind me, just straight on, and it'd be really underwhelming. There would be nothing really for you to see. But if I got along the edge of it, if I put my camera right up to the edge of my wall and took a picture and really focused and played with my depth of field, I could create a much more interesting image that way. Here's a basket, something really simple. Simple things have very interesting textures, and it truly is all about how you take the picture, what angle you're taking the picture at, and what aperture you're using for the depth of field. There's another one, the contrast of shiny and textured. All right, so that's what you're going to be shooting. You're going to be shooting lines and textures for this first assignment, and I really, really want you to focus on playing with that depth of field, controlling your aperture to get shallow and deep focal planes, depths of field. All right, if you have any questions, let me know.